Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 24 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vancouver Canucks, in which the Sharks have lost 4-3 in overtime. This is technically a singular point in the standings, but I'm sure David Quinn and the San Jose Sharks as a whole will still be disappointed in the results. Sometimes you'll play a game that goes to overtime, you'll get an overtime loss, and you'll feel like, wow, we really stole a point here tonight. But other games, and in particular here tonight against the Canucks, you'll play that game, you'll lose in overtime, and you'll feel we should have been able to get the 2 points instead of just the one. And that is the case for the Sharks. This was a game in which the Sharks, I would say, looked pretty much better than the Canucks through the vast majority of it. Really, the only time that the Canucks looked better was early on in this game, but the Sharks quickly turned that around, got some great chances for themselves, but a few crucial mistakes ended up in the back of their net, and when we would eventually head to overtime, another crucial mistake would end up in the back of their net, and the Sharks would end up losing. But let's start off in the first period. The Canucks, like I said, were the better team through the first 10 or so minutes of this one. This is not that much of a surprise. The Sharks last played on Friday, while the Canucks are coming off a big win against the Vegas Golden Knights just yesterday, and so it's possible that the Canucks kind of were much more ready to play than the Sharks, who found themselves on their heels, and they gave up the first goal of the game to Kyle Burroughs to make it 1-0 Vancouver. But as the first period wore on, the Sharks got better and better, got some great shifts from their third line, from their first line, and managed to claw back in shots, even surpass Vancouver. So by the end of the first period, while the Sharks were trailing by one, it felt as though there was a good energy and the Sharks could make some sort of comeback here with a lot of time still left in the game. In the second period, the Sharks would score the only goal of that middle frame, and it would be a bit of a lucky one, even though the Sharks would be generating a couple of very good chances for themselves, with Demko making some key saves. It would be a very lucky one that deflects off of like Luke Cunning's back, a crazy goal, probably the craziest goal we have seen thus far this season, at least from the Sharks' perspective. Though that one against the Ducks that Silfverberg literally scored on himself is kind of funny, but this one in terms of bounces is probably the craziest one, as the Sharks would tie the game, and that would be the score heading into the third period. In that third period, the Sharks would manage to get a power play, and Logan Couture very quickly, after a crazy deflection off of, I believe, Pettersson's stick, or potentially Ethan Bear's, would put the Sharks in the lead for the first time this game, 2-1. However, the Canucks would very soon answer that by tying the game at 2, and then just a couple minutes later would take the lead back with Elias Pettersson. However, the Sharks would not be discouraged. Unlike in previous nights, while the Sharks had pretty bad goaltending, like against the Los Angeles Kings, where suddenly the Kings taking a lead kind of deflated the San Jose Sharks, because these were just kind of goals that, you know, the players maybe felt a bit more responsible for compared to the goaltender. They had a lot more energy to be able to make the comeback, and so some good shifts followed that Pettersson goal, and eventually Cunnin, off of a beautiful pass from Erik Karlsson, would tie the game, his second of the night, to make it 3-3. And while there were some chances as the game came to as the regulation came to a close, in particular the Canucks came very, very close to scoring within the last few seconds of the third period. Ekman Larsson almost beat Kakkonen. The Sharks would end up going to overtime anyway. The Sharks, there were a couple of scares in the overtime. There were Erik Karlsson, a saucer pass was picked off from Pettersson, but eventually the Sharks got some possession, but unfortunately they lose the possession. The Canucks get the puck back. Myers feeds JT Miller, and then while the Sharks are in the middle of a line change, they don't necessarily see this cross ice pass, this very, very far north-south pass coming from Miller to Kuzmenko. He's right at the blue line, cherry picking there, manages to get the pretty much breakaway, I would say, to get the Canucks the victory. So the Sharks, they played well. They definitely played well enough to get the 2 points, but they only ended up with the single one. Moving on to the players here, we have the first line of Meier, Hertl, and Labanc. Not a terrible game for this first line, certainly not as dominant as we have seen, but still pretty good, and I would say definitely good enough to be able to win a hockey game. The one thing that I do want to mention here, I talked about how Meier has just been really, really good thus far this season. Absolutely. I talked about how Labanc has fit in pretty well onto this first line, and I also did mention a bit about Tomas Hertl and how he has sort of shifted into a bit more of a playmaking role because of the sort of the role that Meyer fills, which is essentially just shooting every puck on net that he can possibly do. And so Hertl has kind of moved into the passing role, but even so, we have seen in the past that Hertl is very capable of creating plays for himself, and we really haven't seen much of that thus far this season, and even dating back to last year. And so while Hertl definitely, you cannot say he has been bad, he definitely has been good this year, you don't really pay a player over $8 million to be good. You pay a player $8 million to be great, to be elite, and Hertl hasn't necessarily shown that much this season. He has been a good complement for Timo Meier, but it has been Meier driving this line forward so often, and Hertl has kind of been a passenger in that regard. I want to see Hertl be able to activate a bit more. Not necessarily he has to score every single goal. He doesn't necessarily have to be a 40-goal scorer like Meier could very well be by the end of this season. Even if he ends up still with, 50, 60 assists by the end of the year or something like that, that would be perfectly fine. But we've seen in the past with amazing playmakers like, of course, Joe Thornton, and we can't expect Hertl to be at Joe Thornton's level at any point, but we've seen a playmaker can still drive a line forward even if they end up feeding that puck to their shooters. And Hertl, if he wants to be in more of that playmaking role, and he kind of has to be with the presence of Meier on his line, he needs to be able to do more for himself, and it's just not really happening that much. On the second line, we have Barabanov, Couture, and Nieto, and while the first line was average to above average, which was good enough, the second line was definitely below average. A rough night for this second line as a whole. In particular, Barabanov stood out in a pretty negative light, while he was still doing some solid things in the offensive zone, keeping the puck away from the other team, finding some very nice passes. In the defensive zone, there was a lot of missed coverage, and you could definitely pinpoint him as a real issue for the two Canucks goals that they did score in that third period. And so a rough game for the second line as a whole, and Barabanov in particular. On to the third line. This was probably the San Jose Sharks' best line of the night, I must say. I mean, they've just really found some just unforeseen chemistry, which is kind of crazy because Nico Sturm was previously the center on this line with Bonino and Cunnin, and we know Nico Sturm has been pretty good for the Sharks thus far this season, but as a line, that third line of Sturm, Bonino, and Cunnin was absolutely awful. Zero redeeming qualities. Bonino was terrible. Cunnin was terrible. Sturm was pretty bad himself, but now suddenly with the injury to Sturm, Gregor has been put onto this line. Bonino has been made the center, and they've been looking a lot better as of late, and this game has been absolutely the best game for this third line the entire season, for any Sharks third line, any game thus far this season, I would go so far as to say. Gregor, I would say, was probably the Sharks' best player, especially in that first period. Gregor was really driving things forward, created a lot of very good chances for himself. Cunnin also doing some really solid things. Obviously, his first goal, you're not necessarily going to give a ton of credit to him because it was completely lucky. But the second goal, he puts himself in a great position to be able to receive this Erik Karlsson pass. And that's really been the one positive for much of Luke Cunnin's time here as a San Jose Shark, is that while he's been really bad in his own zone, and he's not necessarily driving plays forward, he does manage to find himself in the open spaces, in the open areas to get good chances. And he did that exactly on the Sharks tying goal. And even Nick Bonino, some really sneakily solid plays, I should say, was the player who kept the puck in at the blue line that led to this tying goal from Luke Cunnin to make it 3-3. So generally just a very, very positive night from the third line. On the other hand, the Sharks' fourth line, I wouldn't say they were as bad as they were in the previous game for sure. They had, I think, one or two solid offensive zone shifts, but still you're really not seeing much from this line. And I mentioned in the previous one that once Nico Sturm returns, because of the positive impacts that Gregor has had and the fact that this third line has looked good as a unit, you'll probably be putting Nico Sturm onto the fourth line. And at this point, you're probably going to replace someone like Lindblom and just move Lorenz to the wing because if we take a look just at the ice time for this fourth line this game, the highest ice time player on the fourth line was Lorenz with less than 10 minutes still. Meanwhile, Lindblom was bringing up the rear at less than 7 minutes. So clearly David Quinn has pretty much zero trust in this fourth line to do really much of anything, and they're essentially just there to eat up a couple of shifts to allow the actual players players on this team to play well and get some good shifts in. And so right now the fourth line is pretty much a non-factor for the Sharks. On the defensive side of things, let us of course first talk about Erik Karlsson, who had a spectacular game once more. Not actually too bad defensively, which was definitely nice to see, but on the offensive side, he was definitely the Sharks' best player here tonight. He really set up so much. I talked about Noah Gregor in that first period, and there was that very good shift from the third line that I think generated like 4 shots on goal, which really helped dig into the deficit that they had to the Canucks up to that point. But while Gregor was definitely a big part of that, so was Erik Karlsson. Karlsson has just been doing such a great job complementing literally every single forward line except the fourth line, which is just a lost cause, but every single other forward line at this point, and he did exactly that in this game. In particular, on the shift in which Cunnin scored his second goal, the one that tied it at 3, Karlsson was really the one orchestrating that entire situation, had those beautiful moves, had those beautiful passes. Before even that great pass that led to the Cunnin goal, there were a couple of other ones that could have also led to a goal prior to that. We of course also saw in the first period that Erik Karlsson's slick move to get past the Canucks defender, puts the puck through his legs, walks right by him, gets a great chance. Just generally a superb game from Erik Karlsson, and definitely forgives the slight mistakes that he made here tonight. And on the defensive side of things, unlike in previous games where Karlsson had been really positive offensively but kind of negative defensively, it definitely was improved here tonight. And then the other thing that I do want to mention on the defensive side of things, we saw Ferraro actually step out with an injury here. We do not know the extent of the injury. It could be out a week, could be out a month. I do not exactly know just yet. Maybe we'll even be back for next game, but stepping in for him on that third pairing is Nick Cicek. And obviously this is a loss for the Sharks. I don't think there's really any argument that Nick Cicek is a better player than Ferraro. That's clearly not the case. But if you had told me, let's say 2 years ago, that Ferraro was going to miss an extended period of time, I would have thought that the Sharks would be in a rough position because of that. But at the moment, Ferraro finds himself on the third pairing, and while he does still play some pretty big minutes for the San Jose Sharks, in particular on the penalty kill, he really hasn't been that great this year, which is kind of disappointing. But with this injury, while the Sharks will see a drop in terms of total defensive play, it won't necessarily be that noticeable, especially since David Quinn kind of runs a tight ship defensively. Cicek won't necessarily be exposed as much as he might have been in something like of a Bob Booner type of defensive system. So it is a loss, this injury, but not a massive one. And then finally, on the goaltending side of things, Kähkönen does get the start here tonight. This is because of Reimer's injury. It seems as though, Reimer missed the game against Seattle, then played against the Kings and looked really off. So it's very possible that his injury that he had in Seattle wasn't actually fully healed for the game against Los Angeles. So we'll see if Kähkönen ends up getting rode a bit here, because Reimer may or may not be out somewhat long term. But a pretty decent game for Kähkönen. Not amazing, I would say, especially this first goal from Burrows was one that Kähkönen definitely should have had. It does come through a decent screen, but I don't think it actually ends up hitting anyone on its way to the net. So Kähkönen kind of just gets caught going the wrong way. But on these other couple of goals, this was a really tough one from Mikheyev, definitely a very difficult one from Pettersson as well. And then the fourth goal was, of course, a breakaway, so you're not necessarily going to blame him that much. So it was an okay game from Kähkönen, but he definitely still has room for much improvement. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on the Montreal Canadiens, and you know what that means. That means I will be at the game on Tuesday, so we'll see exactly if the Sharks can reward me with a win or with a loss. Class dismissed.